It's a real pleasure to have Martin Seeleib-Kaiser with us today, who is not only going to talk about some fascinating stuff with us today, but also is a professor of political science and comes to us from Tübingen. And we need to thank the strategic partnership between UNC and Tübingen for helping to bring you here today. UNC has 6 strategic partners and 2 are in Europe, King's College, London, and Tübingen. And today is just one part of how the Center and TAM works to support the strategic partnership, and it's a bonus because we get to have you. So thanks for coming. I'm going to turn it over to the 2 of you to do the formal introductions. Thank you.
Yeah, so we would like to introduce Martin Seeleib. Is that right? Kaiser?
Seeleib.
Yes. Seeleib? Okay. He is now a professor of comparative public policy at the Eberhard Karls University in Tübingen in Germany. He was previously a professor at Duke for 3 years and then at Oxford before that. Martin's research focuses on the politics of social policy and comparative social policy analysis. And one of his areas of interest is the social rights of EU citizens in different member states.
Great. Thank you very much for this. Thank you very much for this wonderful introduction. I first have to highlight that our research was funded by the European Union. We have the flag there, the grant number.
Thank you.
Did that? Okay. So, second, because it was funded by the European Union, I must warn you, my presentation might be biased. It's about EU citizens. But also, I must highlight that part of our research was also funded by the UK in a Changing Europe, which was a grant, or is kind of funded by the equivalent of the National Science Foundation here in the United States, the ESRC, in the run-up to the Brexit referendum. And actually, when we initially started with our work on European citizenship, we were not, aware of that we would immediately, after getting this grant from the European Union, get the EU Commission to call us and say, you really need to defend EU citizenship, Laslandor, kind of, freedom of movement. And on the other hand, people from Her Majesty's government in London saying, you need to deal with these EU citizens, tell us how many of them are benefit tourists just coming to Britain to exploit Britain. So this was the starting point of the research some years ago. First today I'm going to talk about some kind of theory and concepts, talk about citizenship and social rights in Europe, and then take you to the North German Confederation, 1867, and before concluding, take you to the United States. Okay, because all of this is interlinked. You've probably heard, some people saying that European Union integration is unique, right? It's not a nation state, it's not a federation, and so forth. It's unique. What I'm going to show you today, it's not unique. Okay, but the starting point of EU citizenship is the Treaty of Maastricht, right? Ever since the Treaty of Maastricht, we have been European citizens. We have a passport, we have a European health insurance card, which is, part of that citizenship. And for those who have, I don't know how far you are with your classes in British politics, might have heard about Brexit, might be following Brexit, the newest kind of things, and the pound is going up, which seems to indicate that now people in London believe it's not going to be a hard Brexit. But I'm going to talk about that politicization a bit, and highlight how citizenship is actually really stratified in Europe, and then have some comparative stuff. Okay, so citizenship. Citizenship is actually, as C.H. Marshall would say, a status bestowed onto those who are full members of a community. And Marshall had this idea that citizenship is based on 3 elements: civil rights, political rights, and social rights. And you need the social rights actually to be able to enjoy the other rights. Right? This is what citizenship is about. And Ralph Dahrendorf, and I need to advertise Tübingen, Ralph Dahrendorf is the founder of sociology at Tübingen University before he became EU Commissioner and later on went to Britain. to become the head of the LSE and so forth, he said social rights are the final stone in the ark which holds up the roof of citizenship. Right? So basically, if we follow from Marshall to Davidoff, social rights, at least for Europeans, are core of what constitutes citizenship. Now, if we go back into history and we think about social rights or poverty relief, initially you could only have support by your local community, by your home community, usually the place where you were born. Now, with nation-state building, we came up to territorial communities which were internally inclusive, externally exclusive, right? So it's basically citizens, nation-state citizens, who are entitled to benefits. Those who are not citizens, not entitled to citizens. And Maurizio Ferreira has called it kind of national closure. And that's also how welfare states were built, and I'm sure John has told you all about how welfare states evolved, nation states being important, social democratic parties within nation states being important. However, I want to highlight Raymond Aron, a French guy, who said that there are no such animals as European citizens in 1974, that's that long ago. They're only French, German, or Italian citizens. But, ever since Maastricht, they are, at least formally, EU citizens. Now, and, as I will highlight in a minute, one of the fundamental rights, very often argued, is the freedom of movement. However, the freedom of movement goes much further back in history. It goes back to the Treaty of Rome and the freedom of movement of workers. And why is this so important? It's so important. Without freedom of movement of workers, we would not have the European Union, basically, because the Italians were so adamant to have freedom of movement of workers due to the fact that we had really high unemployment in Italy, and as part of the way of dealing with that high unemployment in Italy would be mobility within the European Union, or within the European community at that time. However, intra-EU mobility remained really low until the 1990s. Then came, the fall of the Iron Curtain. Subsequently, in the early 2000s, Eastern European countries, Central and Eastern European countries successfully becoming members of the European Union in 2004 and 2007. And what is not really well understood today is, and it's not, by the meantime, it's 17 million people, EU citizens, live in a different member state as of which they hold citizenship. To put that in perspective, that is the number of inhabitants of the Netherlands or of Sweden and Denmark taken together, right? So it's not a minor thing. It's 17, or here the bit older data. It's 16 million people. So it's another nation state, so to speak. Now, if we look at the distribution throughout Europe, we see that, and I excluded, and this could be a kind of a quick test, 2 member states. Who finds them? Luxembourg, 1. Second?
Malta.
Cyprus. Okay, because if Luxembourg and Cyprus would be included here, the graphs would be totally off, right? Because this tells you EU migrant citizens in percent of total population, because Luxembourg has a very small population, but a high percentage of more than 40% of EU nationals living in Luxembourg. Similar to Cyprus, with British pensioners living in Cyprus. Okay, so here we have, Ireland in 2016. About 8% of the Irish population living in Ireland are EU nationals, so of other EU member states. Then we have Belgium, no surprise, right? After surprise, Austria. Austria is up there. Why? Munich is very close. Football players, Bayern Munich. Any football players around? Soccer players around here? So, in terms of having some tax advantage, you might not live in Munich, but in Austria, from Bayern Munich. Some of them do. And then you have the United Kingdom and Germany and Spain, right? And then you have countries in Central and Eastern Europe where very few other EU nationals live. So it's very unequal in the European Union. If then we look at percent of EU migrant citizens as a share of total population in the three big countries, as you will remember, the United Kingdom, Germany and Spain as the big countries, not small countries where you have. So we see here that Germany for a long time has had, a more or less kind of relatively high number of EU nationals living there. It has something to do with German history and the so-called guest worker programs, people who migrated in the 1950s and 60s, and eventually some of these were always EU citizens or European citizens of the European communities, but others became EU citizens as these member states became EU member states. And then, there's a caveat in terms of the data. The data is rotten, right? So it's the best you can have, but it's really, it's not reliable, because how do you know who is in your country, right? And then we have this country, which is called the United Kingdom. We have two dots and then a line. The United Kingdom does not have any registration, and they use kind of surveys. If you were at London Heathrow, and never ever one surveyed me, but it's unfortunate. But the numbers are totally unreliable, so they're off a bit, but it's the best that can be done. But you see that in the UK was really low, Spain was really low, and Spain actually really skyrocketed, right? And the second, I will tell you who that is.
Pensioners.
He says pensioners. Is he right? Partially. Partially, because we differentiate EU 15 countries, right? So the Brits coming to Spain, it's actually British pensioners, this one, right? EU 15, they're old member states. And you see that in Germany it's quite stable. And then you have in the UK, from French, Germans, not that many increase. Then we have, EU migrant citizens from A8, so those countries that joined in 2004. And here, although they were at the center of the Brexit debate, we actually didn't know how many people were in the UK. We have 3 dots for that period, right? And in 2013, David Cameron announced the Brexit referendum based on those numbers, perhaps. Perhaps he had, intelligence, other intelligence. You see Germany is a slight increase, Spain, nothing happening. And now, John, this is it. It is Romanians moving to Spain because of language issues, right? So the Romanians didn't go to Germany or the UK prior to 2014, but to Spain because out of language issues, because it's much easier. And if you would have data for Italy, you would see a similar graph, right? Okay. So, Citizenship Directive. You will learn all about directives and stuff like that. I'm not going to bore you. Just want to highlight a couple of issues. Individual rights. So as an EU citizen, you have an individual right, this directive says, right? To free movement, and it's one of the fundamental freedoms. Also something that my friends in Britain never really understood what a fundamental freedom is. You don't mess with fundamental freedom. And union citizenship should be of the fundamental status of nationals of the member states when they move. Okay? Now, but then, we had all this debate, and I just want to highlight some. And it started out basically, some of the quotes that I get here, started out 2007, British jobs for British workers, by Gordon Brown, Chancellor of the Exchequer, so the Finance Minister of the United Kingdom. David Cameron, at that time a Tory, a Conservative MP, ridiculed Gordon Brown whether Gordon Brown had copied it from the British Nationalist Party. Right? So David Cameron, in 2007, in the House of Parliament, ridiculed Gordon Brown for this, saying British jobs for British workers. Then, a couple of years later, in 2011, we had Ian Duncan Smith. What the EU is now trying to do is get us to provide benefits for those who come to this country with no intention to work, people like me, and no other means of supporting themselves, with the sole purpose of accessing a more generous benefit system. Okay? And I know some of you have taken the welfare state class. I'm not so sure how far you already have have progressed in terms of Britain as a generous welfare state or not, but it's probably not the most generous in the European Union. And then we have Gerard Batten. Our membership of the EU means that we're essentially inviting every parasite in the EU to come and take advantage of our housing and benefit system. Speaks for itself, right? Then we have David Cameron. 2 years, the Brics Referendum is already on the agenda. He had promised it in 2013 that there will be a Brexit referendum. In 2014, he says, someone coming to the UK from elsewhere in Europe, who is employed on the medium wage and who has 2 children back in their home country, they today will receive around £7 per month in benefits in the UK. That is more than twice what they receive in Germany, 3 times more than they would receive in France. No wonder so many people want to come to Britain, right? So it's not, people were coming to Britain, especially from Eastern Europe, to get these benefits, okay? It was argued. And, people of that government asked me, Martin, can you provide something? And, we couldn't find data, but this is what you could then, that is the 2014 EU election. EU policy at work. British workers are hit hard by unlimited cheap labor. One of their posters. This is, also UKIP, also 2014. Eastern Europeans can lay over 1,000 eggs in just 1 year. This is Bojo. Bojo, 350 million to the NHS every week. And this is, the breaking point. Farage, using images from 2015 migration to Germany from Syria. And, the US had failed us all, kind of alluding to that all these people would come to Britain. In 2015, Britain agreed to take in as many people over a 5-year period as Germany took in at that time on 1 weekend. Right? Just to put it in perspective, right? So it was 20,000 or 25,000 over 5 years' time that they would accept asylum seekers, refugees from Syria. But the slogan was, taking back control. That was the core of it, right? Now, then you see here, just, in terms of what is the most important issue, immigration, one of these standard questions. You see that in the mid-1990s, it goes up. This is, 2004, Central Eastern European countries becoming member states of the European Union, and there were only 3 countries that had freedom of movement from day 1 for these new EU citizens, which was the United Kingdom, Ireland, and Sweden. All others had transition agreements. So people could come to the United Kingdom, and they did, but as you have seen, in terms of much larger numbers, went to Ireland. That's also the year that I went to the United Kingdom, 2004. So as a poverty migrant, then it declined, and this is sometime Cameron becomes MP in 2010. Then in 2013, down here, he promises, in terms of it has actually declined in terms of whether immigration was seen as a problem. He then, in order to please his own party, says, we'll have a referendum. And then, as you have seen, the intensity and of remarks about Eastern Europeans, or Europeans in general, increases again. And May 16 is the month before the referendum. Ever since then, it has declined again. But this is, here you can see how it can be actually politically constructed, what is a political issue or not. If you ask, a different question, whether it's a good thing for other EU citizens to live in your country, 2016, the year of the referendum, you see that only 50% of British respondents in Britain have responded that it is a good thing, next to Italy, the lowest percentages. Now, some of the facts. EU citizens actually do not come to Britain for benefit purposes. We've ran a, so there's one issue of, in terms of, for people to be welfare tourists, they would need to know what they're entitled to. So, based on the research that we have done, qualitative research, most people actually come because they want to work, they want a better life, they want to friends, study, whatever, but very few of them understand benefit systems because they're actually, especially in liberal countries, really difficult. Then there are some studies that take into account how much they pay and actually use and so forth, and they come to the conclusion, so Dussmann-Fatini is the most cited one probably, that EU citizens are net contributors to Britain to a significant extent, and then you can debate whether it's 30% more than the average or not. I don't want to go into that. Okay, so what is more important that I want to go into is the legal contestation of what it means to be an EU citizen. So once upon a time, there was this French student, just hard-working student like you, Grilchik. Grilchik studied, where could he study as a French person? In Belgium. Worked hard for 4 years studying. In his last year, this hard-working guy needed support, applied for public assistance in Belgium. The Grilchik case, went to the European Court of Justice, and the European Court of Justice ruled that, as an EU citizen, he should have access. So Grilchik got access. But then we have the Brics case, which is Germans going to Austria. The Dano case is the Romanian in Leipzig, in Germany, and the Alumanovic, Swedish nationals, also in Germany. It's all about whether they can access the German social assistance scheme. Okay? So the Germans don't necessarily debate issues as the British, as awful, but they take it to the courts and actually deny all, benefit claims. And then, as Four argues, the European Court of Justice changed its construction of the case. So you had Grilchik, hardworking student. Ms. Dano is a Romanian, has no education, doesn't work, is a single mother, and has no intention to work. Right? So they constructed, if you read the case, which is very uncommon for the European Court of Justice, actually put all this down, which is irrelevant for the adjudication. Right? So they have this hardworking French student in Belgium, and the Romanian single mom, not educated, not wanting to work. And they come to a different conclusion. Now, in the European Union, as EU citizens, workers have all the same rights. And it more or less might work, but you cannot be discriminated against. But if you are economically inactive, nice term, right? So just as you, economically inactive, or if you are a job seeker, right? So something that was initially intended by the European Union from the very beginning, right? Remind you, 1957, Treaty of Rome, the Italians wanted the job seekers to be mobile, fundamental right. You are economically inactive. And you should have comprehensive health insurance and not become an unreasonable burden for the state, i.e. apply for social assistance. The health insurance was really, or as it in EU terms, comprehensive sickness insurance, not health insurance, comprehensive sickness insurance, was an issue once Brexit happened and people applied for permanent residence in the United Kingdom. That the United Kingdom, the Home Office, still run by Theresa May at that point, tried to implement that all these students that studied at UK institutions did not have comprehensive health insurance because they used the NHS. Right? They should have brought it from elsewhere. That's why a number of them didn't get permanent residence. It's horrible. Okay, so, but these are the legal rules. So, when people talk about benefits to tourists, it is usually these people, job seekers without a work history in the country of destination, who should be exporting their unemployment benefit from the country of origin. Right? So, we want mobility in the European Union as a market-making exercise. However, you should not become an unreasonable burden of the state. Therefore, in the first 3 months, but up to 5 years, no access to social assistance benefits. Those are the EU rules, because you should be exporting your unemployment benefit from where you come from. Which also goes for retirement. So you export your pension benefits to Spain, right, if you want to live in the sun. Okay, so this is something you keep in mind. And now what we did is, the older among you will see this looks almost like a distance table in an old world atlas.
Yeah.
Okay, so we calculate the absolute net difference of weekly unemployment benefits between country of origin and country of destination, right? So think about stereotypical Romanian going somewhere in the European Union. He or she should take his or her unemployment benefit to the other member state. However, he or she, if we had some calculations, we took 67% of, if she was making 67% of average wage, because these are younger people, they don't have the average wage, probably a bit lower, so we took 67. He can export about 27 euros a week. 27 euros a week. So just imagine, for all of you, another recommendation when you go to Europe next year, take a bit more money, because 27 euros a week might, in London or in Berlin, the afternoon is gone, right? So what you see here is, if we would really have benefit tourists, it would be the Danish, right? Because the Danish would have an unemployment benefit per week, according to this calculation, of 367 euros, right? Because you can only export the non-means tested parts of these things. What you see then is that there's a line going from east to west through Europe. So for the old member states, it's fine. They can move back and forth across borders without losing out and search for a job. By definition, how social security coordination, as it's called, works in the European Union, people coming from Central and Eastern Europe, they are commodified and need to take up the first best job they can find. Right? So there is no minimum standards. They're not eligible to social assistance. So that is why, obviously, there's also a great threat to exploitation of these workers. Because if they arrive in Berlin, London, Frankfurt, or wherever, they take up the first best job. If you look at pensions, and here we have taken the annual one, you get a very similar picture. And you have benefit tourists here, going to nice places like Spain, right? And you have people, from Central and Eastern European countries that actually cannot make use of their fundamental freedom to move in the European Union. And it's a question of, is this a problem or not? Does one need substantive social rights for freedom of movement? Or is freedom of movement only for those who can afford it? And all the others have to go home. Interesting concept. If you have EU citizenship, what constitutes home? And sometimes it's also hard for commissioners, because they also argue with home, because they have still not internalized what EU citizenship might actually mean. So basically, again, big issues with, in my view, with citizenship, especially if social rights are the final stone, which ones are. They are, right? So are EU citizens, all EU citizens full members of the community or not? Does it only work for those living in northwestern Europe, not for the rest? For me, very important issues. Or is EU citizenship just a hollow concept that, we have a nice passport, but otherwise, and you might go to an embassy in a country which does not have an embassy of your own country, and you might go to another member state's embassy. So, if we put that into perspective for Germany, just briefly. So, for these people coming from Northern Europe, Social Security coordination works. Right? So these are the ones that are in the green. Then you have Southern Europe. So, people coming from Greece, Italy, especially those coming from Greece, also don't have very much to export. Then you have these are Central Eastern, so these are the A8 states, and these are the Romanian. So in other words, if you put it in a quantitative perspective, descriptive statistics, we have Social Security coordination for those who are actually not moving, and don't have it for those who are moving. Right? This is something to think about. So it works basically for those who are not moving that much, many of them, but it doesn't work for the others. So this is where I said, I will talk about some stuff that, will move beyond kind of Europe, right? And it's a new project which we're just starting on the 1st of October, funded by the German Federal Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs. I'm not so sure that they know what they got into when they agreed to the funding. But what we are doing is, we're comparing it to the North German Confederation and the United States. Freedom of movement and social rights, because, as we argue, it's not unique. These territorial entities have the same issues, or did deal with the same issues. And we could have added Switzerland, but we didn't, because that would have required further resources, which we were afraid we could not get. But Switzerland has similar problems. Okay, so North German Confederation. Who has an idea of what that was?
It was a sort of transition state between the Prussian kingdom and the United German Empire. It was established after Prussia won the Battle of Königgrätz in 1866 and took the northern half of what was then the German Confederation, which included Austria. But the North German Confederation did not, the larger German Confederation.
Okay, so it was similar to the European Union. It was a confederation of states. So nation state did stay sovereign. And you had citizenship of the North German Confederation based on your citizenship of the nation state that you lived in, right? So what we currently have in the European Union. Okay? So, but one of the first kind of laws in that constitution of the North German Confederation was freedom of movement. All of a sudden, people could actually move throughout the northern parts of Germany, what is now Germany, right? So there were no borders, they had freedom of movement. However, we didn't have a welfare state yet, but we had poverty relief. And poverty relief was regulated at the state level. Bismarck, some people like them, fond of the welfare state, others don't like them, put social democrats, socialists in prison. Nevertheless, he said, okay, this is not going to work, because what we are actually looking for is mobility in the North German Confederation for economic growth reasons. Right? People should be able to move from one part to the other, and the restrictive laws on poverty relief would, impinge or limit that movement. So he came up with, and for all those who, study German, Unterstützungswohnsitz, really nice compound word. And it's basically the law. He basically proposed that every citizen of the North German Confederation would have access to poverty relief in whatever territory he or she would reside from day one. Okay? So, contrary to what we have in the European Union, you can imagine Prussia was an important state, the most powerful state, but there were other states. And, Saxony in the east, and, it's an irony that Saxony, they argued that more immigrants than people emigrating would come. Saxony is currently the state which has the highest percentage of AFD voters. There's no connection to that, but nevertheless. Okay, so they were really afraid of, immigrants coming. Other smaller states used unbearable burden of the state, what is now EU law, not become an unbearable burden, so they didn't want it. Others, thought it was an issue about sovereignty, so what in Britain was called taking back control. Nevertheless, Bismarck, powerful guy, got a 2/3 majority because they didn't know whether they needed a 2/3 majority, but he managed to get that. And in 1870, they passed this law, right? So ever since 1870, there's freedom of movement and no residence requirements for the duration that you have to have resided in a territory before you can access social assistance, right? So it's not new. Arguments, if you look at those debates, back then, 19th century, very similar. Now, fast forward, we come to the United States. Okay, and most of you will know, 1935, Social Security Act. A law passed by Congress. Actually, some would argue, the start of the welfare state in the United States. And it included social assistance scheme for single parents, basically. ADC, AFDC in town. And the law also allowed residence requirements. The reason for that is you need to know that living standards differed quite a lot in the United States, that they still do. We had the richest state, Connecticut, poor state, Mississippi, probably still applies, or I don't know. I'm not so sure whether Connecticut still is the richest, but Mississippi might still be the poorest. And the FTC benefit was 5 times higher in the 1960s in Connecticut than in Mississippi, right? But it was a law passed by Congress in 1935 that you could actually have residence requirements. So, these states had residence requirements, and when people from Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi moved up north, very often they were given a bus ticket to go back home. Okay? Went to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court said, wait a minute. 14th Amendment, freedom to travel. Can't work. I doubt, but Connecticut argued, and perhaps I should highlight that before, that I doubt that Connecticut can and should continue to allow unlimited migration into the state on the basis of offering instant money and permanent income to all who can make their way to the state, regardless of their ability to contribute to the economy. Think back of what I said at the beginning and the quotes that I provided from British politicians, right? So they're only coming to us because they want this. And so it's not really that alien in this country for those argumentations. It would have budgetary implications, right? These poor people from the south would come to the north and actually rob these northern states. Pennsylvania, also part of that, said, a waiting period encourages newcomers to take up work quickly. No wonder. So if you don't have a benefit, you take up any job, right? Otherwise you go hungry. Okay, so then court says 14th Amendment doesn't work, right? Freedom of travel in the United States, it would discriminate against and it would be penalized the exercise of that right unless shown to be necessary to promote a compelling governmental interest is unconstitutional. However, in the United States, if something is declared unconstitutional, does not necessarily mean that Congress might not pass another law which includes a similar clause, which was the Welfare Reform Act of 1996, to end welfare as we know it by Bill Clinton. Together, I must say, with a Republican majority in the House, once again introduced the possibility of states having residence requirements for people moving to the state. And here was the state of California, which wanted to protect the state budget. And what California did is also has parallels to the European Union and to David Cameron. David Cameron, when he asked for this Brexit referendum, went back to Brussels to negotiate a better deal for Britain, right? And one of his great deals he came back with was that for child benefits of EU citizens, and according, as you will remember, I didn't go into that into detail, of the table perhaps, child benefits you are entitled to immediately once you move to a country in Europe, right? So from day one, you're entitled to the child benefit, irrespective of where a child lives in the European Union. Now, David Cameron really didn't like that because children were entitled to child benefit even if they lived in Romania, Bulgaria, Germany, Austria, wherever. You really need to think about the majority of kids living in other countries might not necessarily be those who the British government thought were the primary beneficiaries. So, anyway, the argument was they should receive a benefit only up to the amount that they would be entitled to in their home, in their country of origin. And this is what California did in the 1990s. So, David Cameron is not, a genius. He didn't come up with this idea. He probably copied it from California, because California had this law. If you moved into California, you were entitled to TANF at the benefit level of the state that you came from. Right? So if you came from Mississippi, poor state, probably still in the 1990s, late 1990s, with the lowest benefit, and went to California, a state with one of the highest benefits, you only received the Mississippi benefit if you had not lived long enough in California. So, however, the Supreme Court really thinks about fundamental rights, and I think this is something for the European Union to think about. Whereas citizens can choose the state they live in. The state cannot choose its citizens. That is what constitutes a fundamental right of freedom of movement. For everyone. In the United States, we have that. In Europe, we don't yet. So, I think it's a really big issue. And I think with the quotes and stuff that I provided, it's not so different, depending on what constitutes citizenship. Does citizenship, then people say, well, the United States is a nation state. But what constitutes a nation state? And how old are nation states? And what is Europe? Anyway. So, I don't think that citizenship, freedom of movement cannot be considered as a fundamental right in the European Union because it does not provide fundamental freedom to all EU citizens. Because social rights are highly stratified. It's a hollow concept. And, thinking again of the nation state and building welfare states, I think we need to have something in Europe which is tangible for all Europeans. And that could be the introduction of the European minimum income scheme, which then would entitle everyone to a minimum of subsistence, wherever he or she would reside. Thank you very much.